From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine. I am Ben Hall. Great show tonight. We are talking about the mayor's race in Nashville. Fascinating race. Incredibly, Election Day is next week. We've seen the commercials. We've gotten to know the candidates. 7 viable candidates want to be the next mayor of Nashville. So we're going to delve into all of that. We'll hear from each one of them tonight, and we are happy to have with us Pat Nolan. Pat, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Always great to have you. All right, so we're going to hear, as I said, from each candidate. You asked them a question when you interviewed them. Why do you want to be mayor? So we'll hear about 30 seconds from each one of them.
Okay.
So that's going to be fun. But I also want to just get your assessment of the race right now. Here we are. Next Thursday night, election night, you'll be here covering it. What do you think?
I don't know if it's my dream or my nightmare that I come in here, and I've had this a couple times. I come in here, and Rory and I put the results on the air, and all 7 candidates have 14% of the vote. 14 times 7 is 98, and we're fighting over the last 2% to figure out who gets in the runoff. Now, I don't know that all 7 will be that closely bunched together, but 1, 2, 3, and 4, you could have very much bunched together up there. So we'll see. It's going to be that close, and there's been a lot of fluidity in this race. Plus, there's a lot of undecided, and I think that it has stayed in the double digits in every poll that I've seen. Now, we haven't had a real professional independent poll done, but the ones that I've seen have all been not way off from each other, and all of them have showed undecided in double-digit numbers.
It's going to be very interesting to see, a lot of undecideds, but it's time now to decide.
Well, there are no undecided voters on Election Day.
Right.
Either vote or you know.
So how do they break? I mean, that's always the big question. But how does that happen? And the question I want to get at is these candidates. It started out. Everybody said, "Oh, they're so similar." Do you think they have differentiated themselves, or are there a group that have differentiated themselves, or what would you say to that?
Well, given if you look again at the poll numbers, even the people at the very front are not that far ahead necessarily of the rest of the field. So you can sort of say this group has sort of stayed somewhat bunched all the way together. I think it's difficult in the field of 7, and all 7 are financially viable. It's difficult to really completely stand out, and nobody has really broken away and gotten even close. Remember, to win this race outright, you need 50% plus 1 of the vote. Well, most of the polls show even the top candidates somewhere in the low to mid-20s. Well, nobody's going to double their numbers between now and Election Day. Nobody's going to win this outright. So it's really like a trial heat for the Olympics. Who gets in the top 2, and they're going to be the ones that run off for the gold after that's over.
Which is why turnout is so important. Because you're right, the top 2 get in, and if there's not a large turnout, the numbers of voters that will determine the top 2 could be pretty small.
The Election Commission says we're going to have 130,000 turnout. That would be on the high end historically of what we've had in the history of Metro. Most Metro elections that are in the open seat category have been lucky to get 100,000 or a little bit more. Right now, early voting, this was through this morning, not today's numbers. We were at 21,000. That's fairly low. If they stay at about 5,000 a day, and that would be the high end of what they've been since we went to the satellite things that started last Thursday, we would still get less than 50,000 in early voting. And if you doubled that, that would be 100,000 if that's only 40% of the vote. And sometimes early vote's only 40, and maybe it's going to be a little lower this time because of the undecideds. But you're still going to be tough to get much above 100,000. But for some reason, people in Nashville don't vote for mayor. They talk about it a lot. People have been asking me for 2 years who the next mayor is going to be, but they don't vote for it. And just by contrast, the presidential election in 2012, we voted almost 250,000 people. We barely broke 100,000 8 years ago.
There's no way to say that when you look at the numbers so far who have early voted, except say it's not very high. It's a low number, it sounds like. And so when you start looking at with 7 candidates, how many votes does it take to get into the runoff? You're not looking at tons of votes again.
Well, if you look at 100,000 and divide that by 7, and of course they're not going to divide up that evenly, but that will give you roughly what you need for the top 2 to get in, or at least the top person to get in. You need a little bit more than that, and then depending on how close the second person is. So we'll see, but no, it's not a huge number, and I think that may be one of the reasons all these candidates stayed in. That, along with the ability either to self-finance large parts of their campaign or raise enough money to stay viable, and all 7 of them have done that. A lot of people thought when the race got up to 7 candidates, well, not everybody was going to stay in. Well, they did.
They absolutely have, and yet I think they all feel like they have a base that will be enough at least to get them in.
Well, and if I look between how close it appeared to be from whatever they'd seen from polling they'd done and other people had done or what they'd heard, and then the undecided vote, and then the overall number of votes that were going to be there, you take all those together, and a lot of them said, well, you know, I think I'll stick in here because I may still have a chance. And who knows? You know, people sort of thought, well, something may happen. I may get an endorsement. Something else may happen in the race. I get a break, and bang, I'm there. Now, obviously, for 7 different people, that's not going to happen, not for all 7 of them. And that's been part of to see what's going to happen. Some candidates have done, I think, have had a little bit more of a breakout than others, but if you also notice in a lot of these poll numbers, everybody except for David Fox, who showed a push late because he saved his money for TV and things and has sort of come up in some of the polls. Now, this latest problem he had with his brother funding a super PAC for him may have retarded his position or his momentum. We don't know that for sure yet. But all those together, most everybody stayed about where they are. There hasn't been a whole lot of movement upward from people, or a whole lot downward, although there's been a lot of talk that Howard Gentry's numbers have not gone up as much as people thought they would, and maybe have retarded a little bit. But he's got strong votes still in the minority community. If that community comes out and votes for him, perhaps in larger percentage than people think, given what Bill Freeman may take away from him or Charles Robert Bone, he could be a contender for this. And remember, nobody thought he was that much of a contender 8 years ago, and he got within a couple of hundred votes of making the runoff.
Absolutely. And so what about that? It seems like the candidates have gone after the African-American vote. How do you think that?
Remember how well the African-American vote came out last year in the judicial races and the district attorney's race. So people begin to see that there is a growing vote out there in terms of political power. And certainly with Howard Gentry in the race and his standing, longtime standing in the African-American community. Remember, he is the only candidate in this race who has won contested one-on-one races. He's run 5 out of 6 races that he's run countywide. So he probably had the best name recognition coming in, and he got in late. That kind of jumbled up the field a little bit. People didn't necessarily expect that was going to happen. Megan Barry's the only other candidate who had run at all as a candidate countywide in the past. She'd won for the 2 at-large races for Metro Council and won those. Those are slightly different races when you can vote for 5 people as opposed to have to vote for 1 candidate out of a field of maybe 2 or 3 or 4. In most at-large races like this time, you have 26 candidates. So, you know, on the one hand, it makes it easier to get a vote because you can be somebody's 5th choice and still get a vote. But still, the rest of the people had either won for the school board like David Fox or had never been candidates before. They had some political experience, but not as candidates. So it was very different. And that's opposed to, say, 8 years ago for the mayor's race, when you had like 5 of the major candidates, and all of them had won multiple countywide races.
Right.
And so that field was much, much more experienced as candidates than this field is. So it's very, 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 very big contrast from 8 years ago.
This, with 7 candidates, you don't see a lot of negativity. There's not a lot of mudslinging, that kind of thing. There's maybe been a little, but not a ton.
The concern, I think, among the candidates is with 7 people, you might shoot at one of your opponents and you might wind up hitting yourself. And in some ways, with what happened with David Fox, that in a sort of a bizarre kind of way, that came back and got him because there was concern, and even David Fox himself apologized for the mailer that went out about Linda Eskin-Rebervik. Turned out his brother was helping to finance that. Now, I don't know what his brother knew about that, but that's what happened. So, again, a shot was taken at another candidate and wound up hitting somebody else. And that's the problem with 7 people. It's kind of hard to do that. Now, we get down to 2, I suspect it'll get a lot more pointed between the 2 candidates.
Are there, so there are different communities, you know, in Nashville, business community, African-American community, all these different communities, religious communities. Has the business community, have they coalesced behind anyone, would you say?
Not to this point. There was a lot of debate and discussion in what's the Nashville Business Coalition about who they might support. They decided at this point not to make an endorsement now. Now, obviously, they know, like everybody else does, it's a high likelihood of having a runoff. So they'll have another chance for that, as a lot of people are, to see who they want to support. If you don't like the one you got this time, you're going to have another chance. If you like the one you've got this time, you may still have another chance to assess whether you want to do that or not. So there is some feeling in the business community that there is both people who like Bill Freeman, who's also a businessman, and some who don't. There's been sort of a move for a while of the anybody but Freeman candidate, not unlike what we had with Bob Clement 8 years ago. There was an anybody but movement. In that case 8 years ago, the anybody buts kind of coalesced around Carl Dean before August, so he wound up leading the vote in August and ultimately won it when we got into the September runoff. This time there hasn't been a coalition behind anybody else. Say if there is an attempt to try to beat anybody but Freeman candidate, that person has not been found or anointed. We may see whether that happens or not, again, depending on if Bill Freeman gets in the runoff. He's led most of the polling so far, so I think he may have the best chance to get in the runoff, but I wouldn't say it's a deadlock certainty.
All right, what we're going to do, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to hear about 30 seconds from each candidate, because you ask them, why do you want to be mayor? Always a good question. And so we'll hear from each candidate and talk a little bit more in depth about each one of those candidates. So we'll take a break, be back right after this.